Well-designed lab studies have clear advantages over field studies. Unlike field studies, well-designed lab studies can tell you why an effect that you observe happens, how it happens, and under what conditions it's either weaker or stronger. Field studies, on the other hand, you often wonder about whether they generalize, whether there are other causes for what you see. It's true that field studies make for good conversation topics and kind of intriguing, but you still wonder whether you can really learn from those effects. Now, field studies may look more real, but actually well-designed lab studies that capture the essential characteristics of reality can be even more helpful for predicting what happens in the real world. Let's take an example. Suppose you want to test if decision makers tend to prefer an option that is in the middle or a compromise option in any set of options you show them. Well, with lab studies, you can include the right controls and test it rigorously and find out exactly under what conditions you have the effect or you do not. If, on the other end, you were to rely on field studies, you probably will not have the right controls, and you would be wondering whether indeed there is a general tendency to compromise, or is it just some coincidence that's reflecting other factors. So in conclusion, if you have to choose, it's clear you have to go with lab studies.
I firmly believe that field studies add more insight than lab studies, and there's a very good reason for this, which is that I care about what works in the real world. So if lab studies have their place, it's really to inform the design of the field study, which by my reckoning makes lab studies good, but not quite as good as field experiments. So let's look at a couple of concrete examples from work that the Behavioural Insights team has run here in the UK. We have, for example, run a number of field experiments examining whether different messages in tax letters result in different responses. So I'll give you a couple of examples. We send people variants of a letter in a multi-arm field trial, and we now know, for example, that localised social norms are more powerful than national norms at eliciting responses. So, for example, if you say to people that 9 out of 10 people in the UK pay their tax on time, and then you say to another group of people, the vast majority of people in your local area pay their tax on time, we now know that these localised messages are more effective than the national level messages. Similarly, we know that moral messages telling people that taxes fund public services like schools, hospitals and roads do not work for the general population. Interestingly, they seem to work much better at eliciting responses from people with large tax debts. Now, the reason that I'm giving you these two examples is that we could have learned these insights from lab studies by testing variations of these messages to people that we had, for example, paid to participate. But if we did so, it would have firstly been really difficult to find the individuals with the characteristics that we so desire, for example, people that owe more than £30,000 of tax debts. But secondly, and more importantly, we would have never been completely sure that the findings from the lab experiment would be replicated in the real world. And that's the key point, really. Context matters a lot, and what we really care about is what actually results in people changing their behaviour in real world situations. So to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, I do think that lab experiments have their place, but I think field experiments have a lot more value to add.
Well, in my opinion, I absolutely believe that lab studies can provide better insight into consumer behavior, and here are my reasons. Lab experiments are very effective means by which we can confidently establish cause and effect. It allows us to do so because we can isolate the independent variables from other variables and study its effect on the dependent variable of interest. Second, lab studies also allows precise control over other variables that you want to keep constant over different conditions. With precise control, you can confidently claim that it is the independent variable that you are interested in influence the dependent variable, and nothing else would play a role. And finally, because lab studies have well-established manipulations and dependent measures, it allows you to easily replicate. The more often that you can replicate an experiment and observe the same results, the higher confidence you have to claim that the theory that you test is valid. Therefore, I firmly believe that lab experiments is the most effective way to provide insights of consumer behavior.
The question is if the best insight is gained by field experiments, and I want to argue, absolutely. What good is it if I find an effect in a controlled lab environment when I don't know if it will hold outside of the lab in the so-called real world? What if we have regular people of all kinds of ages, races, with different jobs, not just a fairly homogeneous group of young students? What if we have people who are in their unique situations, rather than students in the lab that know that they are being observed, that know they are being studied, and that might try to guess what the experimenter wants from them and act accordingly? In the lab, everything is stylized. Things are often simplified, unreal. People have plenty of time to make their decisions. They have to make only one decision without the influence of any other factors, without considering previous decisions, next decisions. Reality is noisy. There might be spillover effects from one situation to another. I might be shopping with a different group of people. I might be in a rush. I might not be able to pay so much attention to every single decision that I'm making because I have so many other things on my mind. So there are differences between the lab and the real world, and if we find something in the lab, I don't think we can be sure that it equally operates in the real world, that it equally exists in the real world. And isn't the real world ultimately what we want to affect, what we need to study, what we need to understand? If so, the best insight is gained by field experiments.
So the first reason for why I think labs are the best setting is that it's the only way in which you can really isolate the cause of an event. You can do this by holding other factors constant and by systematically varying them. This is not easy to do in the field, and in fact, I would argue it's almost impossible to do that in the field. So as an example, there's field evidence for higher spending with credit cards, and one argument that could be made is that credit cards lead people to spend more money. But this can be easily explained by thinking about differences between those who own credit cards and those who don't. In other words, there's a problem of self-selection. And running studies in the lab help you to get around these issues of self-selection by randomly assigning subjects or participants to different conditions. So that was the first reason, to isolate cause. The second reason that I think lab experiments are better than field experiments is that you can go to the limit and study what can really happen rather than what does happen in the field. What does happen is determined by a number of different extraneous circumstances. Extraneous meaning we aren't really interested in them. But in the lab, we can look at what can happen under a set of pre-specified conditions. Whether these conditions really exist in the field or not is not of concern, because we're trying to study extreme situations of what can happen. As an example of this, Berkowitz and Donnerstein many years ago documented that exposure to TV violence leads children to become more aggressive. This is an example of something that can happen as a result of TV violence. It doesn't mean that all teenage violence is a result of TV exposure or exposure to violent programming on TV. The third reason I think lab studies lead to greater insight than field studies is because they allow us to study phenomena that are really stretched out in reality in a very limited amount of time. In behavioral economics or decision-making research, we often want to study events that are spread out over time. So for example, in the Gorville and Soman paper, where they study sunk cost effects and payment depreciation, it would be really hard to study this effect in the field because payment depreciation requires a time lapse between the sunk cost and the effect. Admittedly, they do a field experiment in this paper. However, there is a big alternative explanation which the authors themselves point to. The idea that over time there's a memory lapse for the cost that was incurred months in advance. So this alternative explanation, I think, really makes field studies problematic in that you can't have a valid inference of what caused the effect.